Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most profound, truly game-changing transformations in European history. We're looking at how a relatively small, isolated nation completely redefined itself, and in doing so, really set the stage for the modern world.
Section 1. England's Golden Renaissance. We'll be covering the defining years from 1558 right through to 1603. In 1588, a tiny island nation with a small fleet faced the most powerful empire in the world, and against all odds, they won. That single victory did more than save England. It ignited a golden age that would forever change the destiny of Britain. This is the story of the Elizabethan Era.
To really grasp the sheer magnitude of what went down in 1588, we need to rewind a bit and get some proper context. Imagine the scene in Europe. When Queen Elizabeth ascended to the throne in 1558, literally 3 decades before the Armada even set sail, England was, well, a pretty minor, isolated player on the global stage. It was entirely overshadowed by these massive, incredibly wealthy continental empires that dominated the politics and the economics of the day. Nobody was placing bets on England to become a superpower.
Okay, let's dive into the stark contrast, because it's pretty wild. In 1558, the country was just incredibly financially strained from previous administrations. It was deeply and violently divided by religious turmoil and, frankly, highly vulnerable to invasion. Yet, fast forward to the time of Elizabeth's death in 1603, and the narrative had completely flipped. England had become this supremely confident Protestant nation with rapidly growing global ambitions.
What's truly fascinating to me is the iconography of the era. You see all these royal crowns, the rich reds and deep greens, the iconic Tudor rose. This dramatic transformation from a vulnerable little island into a confident power, it wasn't an accident. Elizabeth actively cultivated a very distinct national identity, deliberately using these exact symbols of royal authority to pull her people together and unify them.
Primary sources from the period, especially the writings of the historian William Camden and the official state papers, reveal a monarch who is constantly walking this tightrope, balancing harsh political pragmatism with absolutely brilliant symbolism. When she was heavily pressed by her advisors in Parliament to secure an alliance through marriage, she famously refused. Instead, she boldly declared herself already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England.
That strategic decision to refuse marriage was honestly a stroke of absolute political genius. Think about it. It prevented England from being subordinated to some foreign king or getting tangled up in the bitter, endless rivalries of domestic nobles vying for power. It preserved crucial political stability during a very fragile time. But more importantly, it allowed Elizabeth to elevate herself into a mythic figure. She became the Virgin Queen. She became Gloriana, the symbolic, fiercely protective mother of the entire nation, married only to her country. And this brilliantly illustrates the cultural byproduct of that hard-won political stability. The elegant Tudor court became famous for its lavish scenes. And alongside institutions like the iconic Globe Theatre, the Queen's cultural patronage created an environment where the arts didn't just survive, they absolutely thrived.
The cultural achievements of this era remain some of the most extraordinary in human history. We're talking about a complete explosion of creativity. Giants like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe completely redefining the theater, drawing massive, eager crowds. Edmund Spenser composing intricate epic poetry, and Francis Bacon laying down the very groundwork for modern scientific thought and methodology. Because of the incredible, supportive environment fostered during this time, the English language itself reached entirely new heights of expressive power and sophistication. It was a true renaissance.
All of this newfound confidence built right back up to that pivotal moment in 1588. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was not just a military triumph. It actually became a defining national myth. It cemented a powerful, unifying idea in the minds of the people. The idea that England was a divinely protected Protestant nation chosen to stand firm and independent against the overwhelming might of Catholic Europe.
So the crucial point is that to truly understand history, we really have to look at the entire picture, not just the mythology. The Elizabethan age, for all its dazzling achievements, was not without its shadows. The highly romanticized view of this era often obscures a much harsher historical reality that we absolutely must acknowledge. Because just beneath the glittering surface of that courtly splendor, deep social tensions were boiling over.
This was an era marked by intense religious persecution and the brutal, unforgiving suppression of Catholic plots against the crown. Globally, it marked the very beginnings of English involvement in the devastating transatlantic slave trade, as well as the aggressive, often ruthless push for colonial expansion into new territories. And at home, the severe economic struggles of the lower classes were met with incredibly harsh poor laws and vagrancy acts, reflecting a society that was deeply, fundamentally divided by wealth and status.
Yet for all of its contradictions, the breathtaking art right alongside the brutal persecution, the national triumph alongside systemic poverty, the Elizabethan era established a powerful template in the English consciousness. It was a definitive moment when England really found its voice, asserted its independence, and began to dream of true, far-reaching global influence.
What you should really take away from this is how profoundly this period shaped the future. This era was the first clear expression of a distinct English national identity. It set the foundation for what England believed it could become, a confident, culturally vibrant nation completely unafraid to challenge much greater powers. It is a legacy that would echo powerfully in the centuries that followed.
But England's story was only beginning. Over 2 centuries later, the spirit kindled in Elizabeth's time would explode into something even greater, the Victorian Age. But how would the darker foundations of this newfound imperial ambition ultimately shape the modern world we live in today? We'll leave that for you to ponder. Thanks for watching.
The Victorian Era. Building upon the bold national confidence first forged during Elizabeth's reign, Britain would later reach the very peak of its power and global influence in the Victorian Era, spanning from 1837 to 1901. This wasn't just a period on a calendar. It was a total, absolute transformation. Under Queen Victoria, Britain went from being a major European player to becoming the single most powerful empire the world had ever seen. They were the undeniable leaders in industrial transformation. And honestly, they totally knew it. And really, nothing illustrates that supreme national confidence quite like this. Picture the Crystal Palace, built for the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London. Just imagine an enormous, gleaming cathedral made entirely of iron and glass, stretching endlessly across Hyde Park. Inside, it housed the absolute marvels of the modern world. We're talking everything from massive, thundering steam hammers to the most intricate textiles. Essentially, Britain was throwing a massive global party just to show off. They were practically shouting to the rest of the planet, "Look at what we have built." The Crystal Palace stood there as the ultimate physical symbol of unprecedented technological progress and sheer British industrial superiority. But hey, you can't have a sprawling industrial empire without the means to actually move it all, right? Enter the railway revolution. These absolute steam-powered juggernauts physically transformed the British landscape overnight. Before this, moving heavy goods or traveling long distances was a painfully slow, muddy process involving canals and horse-drawn carts. But the steam engine? It changed the game entirely. It created this rapid, highly interconnected web of industry. Iron, coal, textiles, and people were suddenly crisscrossing the nation at speeds that completely bewildered the Victorian mind. This was the mechanical heartbeat that fueled the world's leading industrial power, literally redefining how human beings interacted with distance and time. Now, as amazing as that sounds, the physical reality of all that progress was incredibly stark. The industrial juggernaut had a very specific and often suffocating atmosphere. Towering smokestacks dominated the horizon, just belching thick black smoke into the sky, while down below lay bustling, chaotic, overcrowded streets. Hundreds of thousands of people were leaving traditional agricultural life behind, flooding into these rapidly expanding urban centers to work in massive factory systems. The sheer scale of this factory production was something humanity had literally never attempted before. It created environments that were loud, crowded, and heavily polluted. It laid the gritty groundwork for the modern urban centers we live in today, for sure. But man, it came at an immense human cost. So the really crucial point here is how that domestic industrial muscle translated into global reach. Because Britain industrialized first, they had the massive wealth, the naval power, and the technological edge, thanks steamships and global telegraph lines, to enable an unprecedented wave of colonial expansion. They weren't just trading out there anymore. They were conquering, administering, and dominating territories across virtually every single continent on Earth. This immense technological and military leverage completely and fundamentally reshaped global borders and economies. Which brings us to an incredibly simple yet absolutely staggering statistic: 25%. I want you to just pause for a second and really absorb that number. By the time Queen Victoria's long reign ended in 1901, the British Empire controlled roughly a quarter of the world's entire land surface. And on top of that, it controlled roughly a quarter of the global population. Think about that. One relatively small island nation in the North Atlantic was directing the political and economic fate of hundreds of millions of people worldwide. It's a scale of dominance that is genuinely difficult to even comprehend today. And honestly, its geopolitical echoes are still being felt in international relations right now. So what was the internal psychology actually driving this massive machine? Well, the Victorians were propelled by a deeply powerful sense of moral seriousness. They didn't just see themselves as an economic powerhouse, they genuinely saw themselves as a moral one. This was fueled by a really potent blend of strict evangelical Christianity and Enlightenment ideals that championed constant, unending human improvement. Words like duty, self-discipline, and respectability weren't just buzzwords, they were the absolute cornerstones of their entire society. An unwavering work ethic wasn't just highly recommended, it was seen as a direct reflection of your soul and your underlying character. Yet, when we peel back the grand, glittering facade of the era, we find a deeply uncomfortable reality. The Victorian era was, at its core, an age of grand contradictions. You had this immense wealth generated by the empire, beautifully decorated parlors, opulent furniture, absolute safety and comfort, but it existed shoulder to shoulder with heartbreaking, grimy, crushing poverty. In major cities like London, unimaginable opulence lived literally mere streets away from absolute destitution. It created a deeply fractured society where all those incredible fruits of industrialization were overwhelmingly concentrated in the hands of a very fortunate few. And this incredible wealth gap mirrored a very dark hypocrisy in their culture. Publicly, Victorian society preached these incredibly strict moral codes. They idolized the family unit and demanded absolute purity and piety. But right below the surface, a distinctly different reality thrived. Widespread prostitution was largely driven by women who were just desperate to survive extreme poverty. And then, of course, there were the workhouses. These were deliberately harsh, punitive institutions designed to make seeking state help so utterly miserable that only the truly desperate would ever dare enter. So, they were publicly celebrating family values while simultaneously tearing poor families apart in these literal Dickensian nightmares. Actually, speaking of Dickens, it was authors like Charles Dickens who truly captured this wild dynamic. He mastered the art of exposing these glaring social ills while simultaneously reinforcing the era's moral values. The brilliant thing is, he didn't write dusty, boring policy papers. He wrote captivating, emotional stories that forced the comfortable middle and upper classes to look directly at the squalor and injustice they were historically ignoring. He vividly exposed the brutal labor conditions, the total lack of public health, and the failing education systems. By tapping into that very same Victorian moral seriousness we talked about earlier, his writings spurred crucial, albeit gradual, social reforms that really began to reshape public welfare. And of course, we have to recognize that this hypocrisy wasn't just a domestic issue. We need to address the era's most glaring global contradiction, the so-called civilizing mission versus brutal imperialism. The Victorians absolutely loved to justify their expansion by claiming they were on this noble quest to bring civilization, infrastructure, and order to the rest of the world. But the harsh historical reality is that this self-righteous rhetoric frequently functioned merely as a moral veil. Beneath all the lofty talk of uplifting the world was a very real system built on brutal exploitation, aggressive resource extraction, and the violent suppression of local peoples across Africa, India, and beyond. Now, through all of this dizzying, unprecedented change, the soaring wealth, the deep poverty, the sprawling global empire, the intense moral debates, there was one incredibly steady anchor: Queen Victoria herself. Over her staggering 64-year reign, she completely transitioned from a young monarch to the symbolic, enduring mother of the empire. She really became a figure of absolute stability, duty, and moral rectitude. In an age where the physical and social landscape was literally shifting daily beneath people's feet, her constant presence provided an incredibly powerful sense of continuity for the entire nation. The very phrase Victorian values became inextricably tied directly to her image. But as we know, history never stands still. By the late 19th century, cracks were definitely beginning to appear in the foundation of this golden age. This high-water mark of absolute British confidence, it just couldn't last forever. On the world stage, serious economic competition was emerging fast from rapidly industrializing nations like Germany and the United States. Abroad, rising nationalist movements within the colonies sent a clear signal that imperial subjects would not tolerate subjugation forever. And domestically, those massive, gaping inequalities we discussed were fueling growing internal social tensions and powerful organized labor movements. The unchallenged, easy supremacy of the early Victorian era was slowly but surely beginning to fracture.
Ultimately, the Victorian era represents a profound paradox. It was a time of breathtaking industrial and global achievement, yet heavily weighed down by deep systemic inequality and imperial exploitation. It was a period that undeniably shaped the modern world more than any other nation at the time. Two eras, two golden ages. Now we turn to the deeper question. Which of these periods truly left the greater mark on Britain?
Elizabethan versus Victorian, the enduring legacy of modern Britain. All right, let's dive straight into the psychology of a modern nation. Having journeyed through both the fiery spark of the Elizabethan age and the towering height of the Victorian era, we now face the most important question. Which of these two eras truly shaped modern Britain? You know, it's such a fascinating question. And that's largely because the answer isn't just a simple one or the other. As we're about to see in this explainer, modern Britain is actually this incredibly complex, somewhat contradictory tapestry woven from two very, very different threads. And, well, looking at these visuals brilliantly illustrates the heart of that contrast. On one side, notice the vivid, colorful Tudor roses, the bold crests, those fierce lions. I mean, this was an age completely driven by romanticism, potent symbolism, and this fierce, almost scrappy sense of national myth-making. Now, contrast that organic, fiery romanticism with the Victorian Crystal Palace. Just look at it. Massive, perfectly symmetrical, entirely orderly. It's an overwhelming display of structure, engineering, and just sheer institutional scale. We're really looking at a deep psychological divide here. One is the fiery romanticism of a young nation finding its voice, right? And the other is the vast, highly organized institution building of a confident global empire. Now, notice the specific words derived from the historical record here on screen. The Elizabethan era is described as a spirit, romantic, defiant, culturally bold. And a spirit is something innate, right? It's something that flares up spontaneously. But the Victorian side, that's described as a character, orderly, moralistic, institution building. A character is something you forge. You forge it through discipline, duty, and really strict codes. So the modern British identity is actually caught in this constant active dialogue between this spontaneous Elizabethan spirit and this structured Victorian character. It's literally like having two completely distinct temperaments living under one national roof, just taking turns at the steering wheel, depending on the historical weather. For example, take the Globe Theatre. It's a towering symbol of that era's incredible cultural explosion. This was a time when the groundlings cheered, jeered, and, occasionally even brawled during Shakespeare's premieres. The Elizabethan pole is fundamentally a pull toward bold, almost scrappy individualism. Playwrights, daring privateers, and a remarkably pragmatic yet highly symbolic queen, they crafted an identity out of sheer cultural boldness. They definitely weren't building massive bureaucratic institutions. They were building a vibrant, confident voice. They were asserting independence right in the face of massive European powers. And that Elizabethan DNA, this idea of being a culturally vibrant island, fiercely independent, constantly punching above its weight, that laid a profound psychological foundation that is still incredibly potent today. So, how exactly does that manifest now? Well, that same Elizabethan spark still flares up brilliantly in the modern British psyche, particularly when the nation seeks to assert its independence or really project global ambition. Whenever you see modern Britain taking an unconventional path, or exporting its unique cultural phenomena like its music, its literature, its amazing creative industries, you are literally witnessing the Elizabethan spirit in action. It's that romantic, sometimes defiant streak that simply refuses to be just a minor player. It's this deeply held belief that cultural vibrancy and a distinct, independent national identity matter way more than just conforming to a broader, perhaps more mundane international order. But then, looking at this bustling Victorian street, just thick with commerce and industry, we see the complete opposite. If the Elizabethans were the spark, the Victorians were the collective machine. This is the legacy of strict societal structure, immense industrial confidence, and the creation of absolute systems. I mean, they were so obsessed with order that they literally standardized time itself across the country just to keep the trains running on schedule. They valued hard work, self-discipline, and respectability above all else, essentially replacing the unpredictable fire of the Tudor age with the steady, relentless steam engine of progress and civic duty.
And that brings us to the modern manifestation of the Victorian character. In times of uncertainty, the modern British ethos heavily relies on this exact pull towards stability, tradition, and measured pragmatism. When the romantic defiance of the Elizabethan spirit just isn't enough to solve a practical crisis, the nation inevitably falls back on its Victorian foundations. It's the reliance on that infamous stiff upper lip, right? The deep respect for enduring institutions, the profound sense of civic duty, and the strong preference for orderly step-by-step reform rather than radical, fiery change. It is, without a doubt, the steady hand on the tiller when the waters get rough. Laying these traits side by side like this reveals something absolutely fascinating. On one hand, we have the Elizabethan traits, defiant, romantic, individualism, and on the other, the Victorian traits, moralistic, orderly, tradition. But the absolutely crucial point to understand here is that these columns do not cancel each other out. Modern Britain didn't just stop being Elizabethan because the Victorians came along. Actually, scratch that. It's more like these opposing traits create a really vital, dynamic tension. The national character essentially acts like a giant pendulum, swinging continually between the desire to be a bold, romantic individualist and the deeply ingrained need to be an orderly, traditional guardian of institutions. Now, applying this idea of a historical rhyme to tangible modern events gives us a brilliant picture of the national ethos in action. Take World War II, for example. We see a perfect synthesis, the profound Victorian sense of duty, order, and endurance, married seamlessly with the Elizabethan defiance against a massive continental power. It was a deeply romantic stand, but backed by total industrial pragmatism. Fast forward to the Brexit years. Now, regardless of where one stands politically, historians observe that the rhetoric utilized heavily drew from both of these historic echoes. There was a very Elizabethan appeal to daring independence and breaking away from a larger bloc, but that was intertwined closely with a distinctly Victorian nostalgia for global trade reach and sovereign institutional control. As you can see, the national ethos consistently oscillates during these critical moments of reflection. Which brings us to the incredibly complex psychology of contemporary Britain. The source material highlights a really interesting dual phenomenon, a simultaneous nostalgia for imperial greatness, alongside a deep attachment to cultural exceptionalism. And it's important to note, these are not the same thing. The nostalgia for imperial greatness, that desire for a highly structured leading role on the global stage, driving trade and international norms, well, that's a distinctly Victorian hangover. But the attachment to cultural exceptionalism, the belief that the nation's truest value lies in its unique voice, its arts, its language, and its defiant separateness, that is pure Elizabethan romance. Navigating modern global politics means continually balancing this Victorian desire for vast influence with the Elizabethan instinct for unique cultural independence. So, as you reflect on everything we've synthesized in this explainer, you naturally start to wonder, which of these two eras truly dominates the modern British psyche? When you look at the news, or when you look at the culture around us, do you see a nation driven more by the romantic defiance of the Elizabethans or the orderly, moralistic pragmatism of the Victorians? Is it the playwright and the explorer, or the engineer and the civil servant? It's a tension that plays out every single day, subtly shaping society's values, decisions, and overall self-image.
Drawing our analysis together, the undeniable reality is that a constant tension defines the modern identity. It is a nation forever navigating between the defiance of the 16th century and the pragmatism of the 19th. And this dialogue shapes not only how the nation views itself in the mirror, but it directly influences Britain's place in the modern world, how it negotiates treaties, how it responds to global crises, how it celebrates its culture. All of it is a continuous, fascinating negotiation between the ghost of Elizabeth's court and the engine of Victoria's empire. Both periods are still very much alive, actively operating in the national mind today. And so we'll leave you with this really reflective image. History isn't just something that happened in the past. It continuously rhymes. The stones of the past build the psychology of the present. So I want to leave you with this final thought. The next time you hear a modern leader promise a new direction for the country, or see a new cultural wave sweep the nation, look closely. Are you listening to the defiant ghost of Elizabeth, or the relentless engine of Victoria? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer today. I'll see you next time.